The year was 1959, and a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov assembled a team of 10 hikers, himself included, with the aim of hiking the Ural Mountains and earning each of them a Grade 3 hiking certification, the highest available in the Soviet Union at the time. Each member of the team was an experienced hiker with many miles under their belts, and the journey seemed like a straightforward one. After spending the night in the small village of Vizhai, the group finally began their journey on January 27th, 1959. The very next day, one of their members, Yuri Yudin, would leave the group. He'd been suffering from joint pain and, realizing that he would be unable to complete the hike, decided to turn around and head back to Vizhai, leaving the group with 9 members. They were Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, Alexander Kolovatov, 24, Georgy Krivonishenko, 23, Rustam Slobodin, 23, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, Yuri Doroshenko, 21, Ludmila Dubinina, 20, and their leader, Igor Dyatlov, 23. The tragically young group set off again without Yudin and continued the journey, which would, for several days, go according to plan and problem-free. That is until the night of February 1st, when a snowstorm hit, throwing the group into a difficult situation. Whether their next moves were an intentional change of plan or a mistake after getting lost, we can never be sure. What we do know is that on February 1st, the hikers deviated from their planned path and began to ascend Kholat Syakhl, a mountain named by the local Mansi people due to its lack of wildlife to hunt. But, with the gift of hindsight, this name seems eerily fitting. When translated, it reads, Dead Mountain. The days passed, and as February 12th, the day the hikers were expected to return, came and went, their families began to get worried. At first, though, no action was taken. Delays are not unusual on hikes such as theirs, especially in poor weather. But on February 20th, a rescue group was dispatched. 6 days later, the group's campsite would be discovered. Their tent, partially destroyed and covered in snow, appeared to have been cut open from the inside. Outside, there were footprints of people wearing only socks, which led to the nearby woods. It was here that they would find the remains of a fire and 2 humans. These were the bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, both lying by a cedar tree, shoeless and dressed in only their underwear. At various spots between the tent and the burned-out fire, the rescue group soon found 3 further bodies, those of Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. It would be more than 2 months, and multiple search parties later, before the final 4 bodies would be found, lying in a ravine 75 meters away and buried under 4 meters of snow. Autopsies on the first 5 bodies revealed no fatal wounds. Slobodin's skull did show a fracture, but it was deemed non-fatal, and hypothermia was reported to be the cause of death of all 5 hikers. The autopsies on the final 4 bodies were a stark contrast. 3 of them were found to have sustained fatal injuries. Thibault Brignol had sustained major skull damage, while Dubinina and Zolotaryov were reported to have sustained major chest trauma. According to Dr. Boris Vozrovdeny, who was the forensic expert who performed the autopsies, the force required to cause such injuries would be comparable to a car crash. Dubinina's body was also found to be missing its tongue, lips, and some facial tissue, which has often brought up further questions about what happened to the hikers that night. The bodies of Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibaut Brignol and Kolovatov were also found to be fully clothed, with additional items of clothing wrapped around them, suggesting that they may have died after the previous 5 bodies, from whom they scavenged extra pieces of clothing to help keep themselves from suffering the same fate. Ultimately, the deaths were ruled to be caused by an unknown compelling force, and the vagueness of this, along with the unusual circumstances of the case, would lead to much speculation and a few controversial claims. One of these claims suggested that the clothing the hikers had been wearing was found to be mildly radioactive, while 12-year-old Yuri Kuntsevich, who attended the funeral of several of the hikers, claimed that their skin had an unnatural orange tan. Another group of hikers near the mountain on that same night also reported witnessing a collection of strange, glowing orange spheres floating in the sky, which sparked theories about what they could be, and if they could have been involved in the deaths of the Dyatlov hikers. But how true are these claims? What is the truth of this case? Well, there are a few theories. Our first theory is perhaps the easiest to dismiss. It suggests that the hikers were murdered by the Mansi people, the indigenous people who gave the mountain its name. But it's a theory that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. There was no evidence of anyone else being present that night, and even if they had been there, and their tracks had been covered, it begs the question of why an indigenous tribe would be there at all in the middle of the night when conditions were so dangerous. There's also the question of why some of the hikers died of hypothermia, likely before their friends received their injuries. It doesn't fit with the idea of a group of people murdering them in cold blood. And what reason would they have to target the Dyatlov group anyway? Even if they had camped on their land, there was nothing to suggest that they were a threat. Would the Mansi really risk their own safety, heading out into the snow late at night to punish a group of harmless trespassers? The answer, of course, is no. This theory honestly doesn't hold up as much more than a fantasy born out of racial anxieties about indigenous people, and it doesn't deserve any serious consideration. Other theories hone in on the main mystery of the case. Why did the hikers leave their tent? The deaths themselves are relatively straightforward to explain, but what we don't know is why a group of experienced hikers would leave their tent in such a hurry, putting themselves in a dangerous situation that would ultimately end their lives. One idea to explain this is infrasound. Infrasound refers to sound waves that are powerful enough to be sensed by human bodies, but too low in frequency to be heard. The idea is that infrasound is subconsciously sensed without us being consciously aware of it, and this can create a feeling of anxiety. There is some evidence that this is possible, but no evidence that it happened in this case, and due to the time that's passed, since then we're unlikely to get an answer either way on that one. The next theory brings us back to those orange orbs in the sky, because, of course, someone's always going to suggest aliens, and this case is no exception. Unfortunately, there's not much behind this theory except for the presence of unidentified objects in the sky, and even their existence is far from verified. They are addressed by another theory, however, that is marginally less far-fetched. This theory proposes that Dead Mountain was the location of a government weapons testing site, and it was one such weapon being used that alerted the hikers to danger and caused them to flee their tent. It's suggested that while the first hikers to die simply succumbed to hypothermia, the later deaths were then caused by a second detonation, explaining the severity of the injuries found on some of the bodies. For a long time, people have pointed to the evasive nature of the Russian government regarding their investigations into Dyatlov Pass, even going so far as to explain that the investigation itself was classified. There is, however, no evidence that this was the case, and no evidence that the Russian authorities were anything but clueless, just like the rest of us, as to the specifics of this case. But while we may never know exactly what caused the hikers to leave their tent that night, we do know enough to be able to put together a reasonable reconstruction of what happened next. The hikers cut open their tent and flee, leaving behind their supplies. They arrive at the cedar tree and realise they've come too far and can't find their way back to the tent. Slobodin attempts to climb the tree for a better look at their surroundings, but he slips on his way back down, hitting his head and fracturing his skull. But with little outward sign of his injury, he powers on. With little options, the hikers start a fire in an attempt to keep warm, while Dyatlov, Kolmogorova and Slobodin head back in search of the tent. Before they reach the tent, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova and Slobodin succumb to hypothermia and die. Back at the cedar tree, Krivonyshenko and Doroshenko suffer the same fate. Desperate now, Dubinina, Zolotaryov and Thibaut Brignol strip articles of clothing from their friends' bodies to provide themselves more protection from the weather and head off in search of shelter. But they don't make it far before the unsteady snow beneath them gives way and they tumble into a ravine below, sustaining in their fall the major injuries that would ultimately bring about their deaths. That still leaves a few loose ends, though. What about the missing tongue? Or the radiation? Well, first of all, Dubinina's missing tongue can be easily explained by her body's exposure to the elements. It's possible that she lost her tongue to a scavenger who went for soft tissue. But it's also possible, considering the position of her body, that her face suffered more rapid decay than the rest of her due to lying face down in running water, speeding up decomposition. Then there's the orange-tinged skin. It's hard to know how accurate this is and how much it's been exaggerated in the retelling, but bodies left to the environment can become discoloured, so I don't think this is really unexplained. Finally, there's the issue of the radiation. The simple answer is that there was no radiation. As far as I've been able to tell from digging into this, the issue of the radiation has been greatly overstated. It seems that this story originates with radiation discovered on Dubinina's coat, but this was trace amounts, and it's not unusual to find trace amounts of radiation on everyday objects. After all, everything gives off trace amounts of radiation, our own bodies included. As far as I can tell, there's no real reason to suspect that the radiation on Dubinina's coat was an abnormal amount, and no reason to think that it wasn't present before the expedition began. So that, really, is the TLDR behind this whole mystery. Most aspects of this story can be explained pretty easily. In fact, since I first started researching this mystery for our website, 2 further investigations have taken place that came to the same conclusions. These hikers felt that their lives were in danger, probably due to hearing or feeling something that they mistook for an avalanche, and they fled their tent, with disastrous consequences. If you have any thoughts on this mystery, I would love to hear them.